Hello, NothingCon. Hello, everyone and no one. I'm Bill, and in the spirit of NothingCon, I think we'll leave that there. We're here with Akilesh IR, affectionately known to me as AK. So that's what that's how I'll refer to him through the interview. We're gonna learn about him and his and what he's doing right now. AK, what's going on, man?
Hey, really nice to talk to you, Bill. I'm really looking forward to this conversation, and I'm very excited to be speaking to all the viewers at NothingCon and all the viewers at home. So yeah, I'm excited.
That's great. That's great. So what is going on? What are you doing these days, and why?
So I am currently, a spiritual teacher, like many of the other people at NothingCon, and I would say roughly that I am in what I describe as a contemporary Advaita Vedanta tradition that derives a lot of its ideas from the work of Ramana Maharishi. And so along those lines, I write articles and books, maintain a blog, I put out YouTube videos pretty regularly, and I also guide seekers one-on-one and occasionally in group format, and sort of guide them on the path to self-realization, for lack of a better word.
I think most people at NothingCon are going to be familiar with Advaita, obviously. So is it Neo-Advaita? Because people get mad about that.
I know. Well, that's, yeah. So what Neo, Neo-Advaita, I think it's like a contested term, and I feel like it's almost like one of those terms which no one will admit to being anymore. No one wants to be considered a Neo-Advaitan. Even people who would be called Neo-Advaitans. So I think my understanding of Neo-Advaita, for how that term has been tossed around, is the idea that there's no path and no practice, right? That is, it's about pure, direct pointers to the self. And not even that, really, right? One might say, if you're a Neo-Advaitan, there's nowhere to go, there's nothing to do, and this is just sort of emphasized over and over again. That is, in fact, a kind of pointer, of course.
Yeah.
So that's in contrast to more traditional paths, which do emphasize varying degrees of gradual practice. And so I would definitely group myself with the latter. I do think there is a very important role for almost everybody, of practice.
Right. Ramana Maharshi himself, he did recommend practice, which was.
Well, it was so he recommended, as far as I'm concerned, two basic things. He's very well known for what he calls self-inquiry, which is, I've sort of taken his ideas, and I feel like, he's obviously, this phenomenal giant in the field, and he condensed and simplified the ideas of Advaita Vedanta so beautifully and so elegantly. And so I've taken some of that, and I've respectfully, I think, elaborated on them. But fundamentally, I view self-inquiry as a process of continually searching for, in a nutshell, that very intuitive, obvious, everyday sense of one's own existence. And never being contented with all the different thoughts, feelings, conceptions, and other possibilities that pop into your mind as you try to hunt for this. So one is on a chase, and one rejects all the objects of experience that come up as potential answers, because they're all limited, until something else happens, something that's not in the ordinary course of events, one might say. That is one big side of Maharishi's work. the other side, which is, I think, in some ways less talked about, but it's also very much there. And in fact, it might be the older strand in Advaita Vedanta, is what I like to call surrender. And surrender is, again, there are different definitions. Ramana Maharshi famously said in Tamil, chumma ira, which means just be, and I like to, if I'm explaining that, I like to say the emphasis is not on the be, it's on the just, just be, meaning what? Meaning stop pretending to be any kind of particular experiencing doing entity. The egoic illusion, which is talked about in Advaita Vedanta and all the contemplative mystical traditions, is the illusion of being a doing, experiencing person, basically. And so, if you can just stop pretending to do that and just be, then that would be a notion of surrender. Another way I like to explain it, which I found helpful, is to ignore all thought, except the thought of surrender. Ignore all thought except the thought of surrender. Maintain only the surrender thought. Why maintain only the surrender thought? Because you can't fully surrender on your own. This is where the notion of practice ultimately runs into something which goes beyond practice, right? So with both inquiry and surrender, practice leads you to a certain point of stillness. In that point of stillness, you persist with the surrender or the inquiry, and then something beyond the mind, we can quote unquote say manifests or something like that. Words can't do it justice, whatever that is. But yeah, so I like to say ignore thought, ignore and relax. That's often an instruction I like to give as an explanation of surrender. Just ignore all thought except surrender, vigilantly remain in that, keep ignoring and relaxing. And, when that leads to that place of silence, to perhaps then at that point ask, one might say, who's the surrenderer, or how can surrender be completed? Some kind of statement like that. It doesn't really matter much what it is exactly, but some kind of longing to go beyond, because that's where practice can lead you. Effort and practice can lead you only to that point, and then something beyond has to go. But that is 99.9% of the work, is to fight the mental habits that would lead the mind outward towards desire and fear, by instead, curbing those tendencies and leading them instead towards either chasing the I, which would be inquiry, or else ignoring all thought and relaxing, which would be surrender. And both of those I see in Maharishi's work, as well as the larger body of Advaita Vedanta over the millennia.
But if one ignores thought, if there's a suppression, and especially if they're fighting this process, right? It seems that they're almost fighting themselves. Doesn't that lend an energy to that process where the thoughts arise? I mean, isn't that can't that in some sense be counterproductive?
So you make a very good point. So I just want to clarify a couple of things. So we've talked about Maharishi's work. In my first book, which is How to Find What Isn't Lost, I sort of lay out a framework which I've more or less stuck to, even though I feel like I've elaborated and refined over the last few years. But it has sort of three parts to it, right? So one is that every seeker has to have, to some degree or another, some kind of intellectual framework, and how much of an intellectual framework they need can really vary from seeker to seeker. But the basic point is that they have enough of an intellectual framework that it provides some kind of guide to the search, and more importantly, it sufficiently satisfies their doubts about the search so that they can be motivated to pursue it. Now, clearly, that's thought, right? So there is an engagement with thought there, right? And then the sort of second facet, I say, is dealing with emotional and psychological issues. And, in that first book, I often emphasize the power of artistic expression to help deal with emotional and psychological issues. But actually, my sort of first line recommendation these days is psychoanalysis, which is a particular kind of therapy that I really like. There again, thought's really important, in that context, right? And then there's this third piece, which is what I call sort of the tip of the spear spiritually, which is this surrender and inquiry piece, right? If the emotional issues, they don't need to be completely dealt with, right? They just need to be dealt with enough, right? Just relatively enough so that one is able to pursue the search, there's no hard line as to how much that is, but if one has enough, not a perfect intellectual framework, but enough of an intellectual framework to pursue the search, hasn't dealt with all their emotional issues, but has dealt with enough of them so that they can pursue the search. Then they pursue the search at that spear tip using these, sort of final methods, you might say, of surrender and inquiry. So I want to say, those first two facets clearly do involve an engagement with thought. Now, beyond that, even in terms of the actual inquiry or surrender, I will emphasize that with both inquiry or surrender, it's not about suppressing thought. So when I say ignore thought, I don't mean stop thought. I don't mean try to alter thought. Like the metaphor I often use, for example, for surrender is, imagine there was a television that was on and you were just told, don't pay attention to the television, right? So you're not asked to turn the television off. You're not trying to change what program it's showing. You're just trying to not pay attention to it. So that would say that would be a little bit different. But that's a really good point. Thank you for bringing it up.
So deprive the thought of attention.
That's right.
There's interest in attention and the way we can speak about those. The metaphor of the cloud in the sky, right? Which everyone knows.
Yeah, right. Yes.
So when you say ignore, you're meaning more. It sounds to me like you're you're not talking about a stoic self-control.
No, I'm not.
You mentioned your first book, and I want to give you an opportunity to tell the NothingConners the name of the book.
Sure.
And a little bit about it, and I've definitely got some follow-up questions on the book itself that I think relate to where we are in the dialogue so far. Definitely.
So the name of the book, which is my first book, and it's called How to Find Resident Lost. I'm not sure that actually shows clearly in the camera.
Yes,
actually, I think it might be mirrored, but and the subtitle is A Short Pro-Intellectual, Pro-Desire Guide to Enlightenment. So this is what I wanted to record sort of after I felt there had been, a sufficient degree of clarity to start teaching. I wanted to sort of record my big picture observations at the time about the search. And as I said, I more or less have stayed with the structure. I think more or less everything I've said is still the case. But I do often, I do feel like some of my emphases have changed. Like, for example, recommending something like psychoanalysis over just individual artistic expression as a way to deal with emotional conflicts. I think the reality is that a lot of the emotional conflicts that people face really are originating from their unconscious, they're originating in their blind spots, and that while it might be nice to think that we can just fix our own blind spots by ourselves, I think many times it's not very realistic. And but basically the book goes through, in its first portion, it goes through what I consider to be a basic intellectual framework for non-duality. What is non-duality about? Why would one think this is a plausible thing? What are some arguments for it that, because what happens is there's a very, very, very strong current of materialism in the educated world today, right?
Really?
Shocking. And, and so everyone is just believes, like it's almost with their mother's milk, that they take it in that, well, of course the mind is nothing but the brain, the world is nothing but atoms, and obviously, how could you believe anything otherwise?
You can have a thought without a brain.
Exactly. Right. Exactly. Well, right. They would exactly make arguments precisely like that. And the reality is, right, that there are actually very good, sophisticated philosophical arguments for why materialism is highly implausible. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that traditionally Advaita Vedanta, for example, says consciousness is all. Now, consciousness is all is, it's another philosophical position. Now, between philosophical positions, I certainly think that consciousness is all is far more plausible than matter is everything. But that said, I have to say, ultimately, the non-dual search is not about philosophical positions, right? So there's something which is beyond philosophy.
So why would you recommend therapy then? Well, let's talk about these two different processes.
Sure.
One is therapy, right?
Yes.
Where the person is working on themselves.
That's right.
And they're working on they're working on their persona, they're working on their emotions,
Yes.
their reactions to the world. Then there's this other thing that AK's trying to interest you in, right? And this self-inquiry, this question, which by the way, I think it's important. I've mentioned this to you before, that the relentlessness that you about how there really is no instant that's not an opportunity.
That's right. So that's a very good point you make. So self-inquiry and surrender are, I like to say, they're every waking moment practices. They're not these formal practices that people pursue sitting down for like 1 hour a day or 2 hours a day or even several hours a day. It doesn't matter, right? Like they are every waking moment practices. Ideally, obviously, that's an ideal to which, almost nobody can actually live up to. And, you don't have to be perfect, but that's the aim. But your question was, if I'm not mistaken, right? So why then pursue something like therapy? Is that the question?
Well, no, my question, the question we were working on was the difference between the two. How one is, this is Lolo, everyone. There is no way we're going to keep him from doing that. That's Lolo. And he's going to be a part of this interview, whether we like him to or not. The question we were asking was, the question I was exploring is the differential between these two processes.
Right. Okay.
One being therapy, where we're working on the person. Right?
Yes.
Obviously, and I think specifically one thing we can ask is, does that process have an ending to it? In other words, would that process ever? And by that I mean there's really kind of two ways we can ask that question. We can say, does the process ever result in a perfected human being? You can use Maslow or whatever metric you want, and you can ask it relative to self-inquiry, whether or not the what's left, because does self-inquiry end? Let's compare the ending of these two different processes, if you would.
Sure. So okay, so let me be clear, right? So intellectual framework aside, right? Then this emotional psychological part, and again, I talk about the intellectual framework and the emotional psychological part as ways of quieting the mind so that one can be free to pursue inquiry. So that's, for example, the relevance of therapy. And I want to say also, to be very clear, there are many different kinds of psychotherapy. The particular kind that I recommend, I do think it makes a difference, are what I would call the psychoanalytic therapies, which are basically deriving from Freud and his successors. And I know a lot of
chemical therapies.
Sorry?
As opposed to like chemical therapies?
Well, not just opposed to chemical therapies, opposed even to other kinds of talk therapies. So for example, right? So for example, what's popular today, especially in our sort of quick fix managed care environment where insurers want to, just solve you very, very rapidly, fix your symptom and pack you off, right? Is what's called cognitive behavioral therapy. And so cognitive behavioral therapy, the way it views the issue is you come in with a problem and a symptom or whatever it is, like anxiety or depression or call it what you will, right? Any number of things. And, they look at it as, okay, what the problem is, and we're going to see what the irrational beliefs that prompt you to sort of, have this problem are, right? And also what are the sort of behaviors in which you engage in, which also sustain this problem. And we're going to try to individually just prompt you to fix those, essentially.
So that's just all relative to someone's social functioning, essentially.
Well, it's certainly relevant to social functioning, but in a way, the distinction I want to draw is that it's all happening on what I would call the conscious level. That they assume the person coming in, who's the quote unquote patient, knows what the problem is, genuinely wants to fix it, and hey, okay, we're just gonna take a hammer and wrench out, and we're just gonna fix you by looking at your thoughts and behaviors, right? Psychoanalysis and the derived therapies have a very different idea of what it's all about. They think that the reason you have these so-called problems is for unconscious reasons, meaning for reasons that you don't know about. And that the reasons that you come into therapy may not really be the real issues. You might be self-deceiving yourself about what the real issues are.
What?
Shocking. Really shocking.
They don't know the content of their own mind? They don't know what's going on? They think something else is going on that's not?
Isn't it shocking?
I have no idea. Wow. That's something new. Yeah, that's I just can't think of it. Any examples in the
in human history, right?
Current events,
or
human history, that where that's ever happened. But yeah,
it's amazing.
So that's the distinction.
So that's the distinction, right?
But what about the distinction? Let's get back to that distinction. I think the NothingConners are going to be more interested in the distinction between therapy. And saying use therapy to quiet the mind.
That's right.
And to try to remove obstacles, which certainly there's certainly a parallel from what little I understand and know of traditional Advaita Vedanta.
Yes.
There are parallels between that and what you're talking about therapy. But how does that differ from self-inquiry?
Okay. So they're quite different, right? So and so you make a very good point, right? So there is in the traditional Advaita Vedanta, there is this so-called idea of a qualified seeker. So one who came to the teacher who wanted knowledge of the self was expected to have all kinds of attributes that qualified them, like they were supposed to be detached from sense pleasures and have patience and have faith and have self-control and have this and have that. And Ramana Maharshi said, kind of a little ironically, he's like, there probably has never been such a qualified seeker in the history of the world, but that said, right, the expectations were higher, and the teachings were given out in monastic settings, right? So the whole context was different. In the monastic settings, you have a community, you're isolated from a lot of other, usual real world concerns. You have this sort of very intimate relationship with a teacher that you could argue is kind of almost therapeutic, and
no doubt.
So all of that, right? And so how does that translate into the modern world? Well, so those attributes of a qualified seeker, we have to have other ways of getting to them, even if it's never going to be perfect, right? But the basic idea is this, right? So what is preventing us? What is basically preventing us from seeing the illusion that is at the heart of the ego? Well, it is this nest, this complex network of identity-based habits that drive us out into the world seeking happiness and seeking to avoid unhappiness, basically. And that network, provides this constant agitation and restlessness, and that makes inquiry and surrender difficult. Now, inquiry and surrender are, of course, meant to tackle that very network, and they do it by hitting at the root of it, which is the I thought. The I is what sustains the entire network. But in order to hit at the root of it, you already have to have culled the network to a certain extent. If the mind is overly restless, it will not be able to practice surrender or self-inquiry in a productive manner. You have to have gotten the mind to a moderately manageable state. It may not be perfect, and there are always exceptions. There are always exceptions to these rules. You can always find examples of people who have extremely, you might say, restless or unruly minds, but who nevertheless perceive the truth. And there are certain exceptional things that are going on in their cases. But generally speaking, for most people, the recommendation is we do want to have, to quiet the mind in certain ways. So for example, right, in the Bhagavad Gita, this is a physical example. The Bhagavad Gita says, seekers should not eat too much nor eat too little. They should not sleep too much nor sleep too little. Now, what's the relevance? These are physical things. What relevance does that have to the spiritual search for the self? Well, it's quite clear. Sleep too much or too little, and mental quiet drops. Eat too much or too little, mental quiet drops, right? So in these sort of basic elementary things where you have some control, why not try to create an environment where the mind is a little quieter? And the same is certainly true. That's what with something like therapy. There are not everybody, I would say, but most people, right, have recurring unconscious inner conflicts to various degrees, often springing from childhood issues, things like that. And, you can't just close your eyes to them and hope and wish them away, because, those issues control you. And, and because they control you unconsciously from a blind spot, they're going to interfere with the spiritual search for their own reasons. And, is it theoretically possible to overcome them purely using the spiritual? It is theoretically possible, but it might, it may be much more uncertain. It may be much harder. It may take much longer, right? When you have the instrument which could potentially make it easier, why wouldn't you use that? So analysis is trying to deal with certain issues in this network of identity-based behaviors that are coming from repetitive, unprocessed inner conflict. Can you open that up? Now, certainly, as you pointed out, there is no such thing as perfection along these lines. There's no end to that process. There is no end to that process, and there's no perfection of that process. And psychoanalysis would never say there's. In fact, Freud famously said, the purpose of psychoanalysis is to convert neurotic misery into merely ordinary unhappiness.
Nice. So in other words, you can't psychoanalyze your way into enlightenment.
You certainly can't. You certainly can't.
And it's turtles all the way down. It's an endless opposition to.
That's right. That's right.
Okay.
That's right.
But self-inquiry. Does self-inquiry have an end?
Yes. So self-inquiry does have an end. So that's a difference between the two processes. So if you've loosened up your culled your mental network of habits, or loosened up certain things so that you can pursue inquiry or surrender, and really I view those as really two sides of the same coin. You can mix and match them. People inevitably do. They lead to one another. They're almost two descriptions of the same thing from just slightly different angles, actually. But yes, so inquiry and or surrender, it does have an end of sorts, but it is it's very paradoxical to talk about. So I have a model now where I sort of view it as kind of a three-part model. so in Zen, there's this idea of the gateless gate, and that is a sort of realization of the self, or whatever we want to call it, right? So the way I view it as is there's three different perspectives we can take, and all three have a certain validity, and all three partly work with each other, and also all three are in some sense incompatible, because really the truth is beyond perspectives. It's beyond perspectives, it's beyond doctrines, and we have to recognize that. So we are dealing with something which is ultimately beyond language and beyond categories. So anytime we talk about it, there's going to be a certain level of inaccuracy. Now that said, so the three perspectives are these. There's a gradualist perspective, which is you have this network of mental habits that drive your mind to restlessness. Those habits need to be culled. When the mind is quieted, it comes to a silent place. In that silent place, you look inward, and then you go to the second perspective, which is quote unquote passing through that gateless gate. That's the sort of aha insight as to quote unquote what is. And that from that perspective, the funny thing is the content of that perspective is the third thing. So the second thing is the sort of sudden all at onceness. There's a gradualism that leads to this sudden all at once insight, but the content of that sudden all at once insight is that there was no search, no seeker, no finding, no enlightenment, none of this, right? So that's
why you told me the answer at the back of the book. So what do I got to do anything for?
Well.
Why do I got to do any of this stuff?
That's a great question. So there is, the real answer is because you can't help it, right? That's actually the real answer, right? The true seeker is driven towards the truth, driven because they can't help it, not really for a particular reason, because they really have to find it. They want to know, they badly want to know.
You tell me I can't help it on one hand, but then on the other hand, you're sending me to a therapist.
That's true. That's true.
You're telling me to surrender in self-inquiry. I don't, you got me confused here, man. Paradox.
There's a lot of paradox. There's a lot.
A wise man once told me that paradox is mental confusion, always mental confusion. So, can you resolve this for me, for the NothingConners? This apparent contradiction.
So look. So I call this the seeker's paradox, right? That the seeker has to keep in mind simultaneously two seemingly mutually incompatible facts, which are that they are seeking, that they must put an effort towards that process, through various means, including, depending on where they are on the path, what those practices are may differ, right? It might be reading scriptures, it might be finding a teacher, it might be getting therapy, it might be practicing inquiry and surrender, right? But then simultaneously keeping in mind this other thing, which is that in some sense, in some profound sense, they're already what they seek. So it's insufficient to have one or the other. You have to have both. And that's because of what I said earlier, that there's something about this situation that can't be fully put in words. Now that said, what I will say is, it is worth it for a seeker. I will just emphatically say that, right? Despite the way I've described it as there is no seeker and no seeking and so on and so forth. But at the same time, that itself is only a perspective in words. There are the other perspectives of that gradualist change of mind and the sudden insight and the resulting, in some sense, but not the sense that people understand it as, attainment to existential truth, and a kind of liberation from suffering. Now,
The
as
T
soon as I
word.
say these words, I'm going to immediately have to say they're misleading. But because what happens is the mind immediately wants to take them, and it wants to make things out of them, right?
Right. Which is exactly what you're recommending to not do with surrender.
That's exactly right. So, but at the same time, I absolutely do say that a desire for liberation, a desire for ultimate truth, these ought to be cultivated, and you should have a burning desire if you want it. And that burning desire will eventually be taken from you, or you'll see it as a kind of illusion, maybe in the end. But that desire will drive the seeker forward. It's necessary for until the very end. So, you must want it. And there is something at the end of the rainbow. There is something at the end of the rainbow, so we have to emphasize that fact too. It's not that there's simply nothing, that's not what I'm saying, but it's not what you think it is. That's also true. It cannot be anything that you could possibly conceive of or imagine. At the same time, the quest is worthwhile. Absolutely. It may not be worthwhile in the way that the seeker imagines it will be worthwhile, but it is worthwhile. And, now for whom is it worthwhile? Well, investigate that question. That's the search.
Yeah, of everything Ramana said, that when he challenges the questioner to find out the source of the question, and that I think is one of his most powerful statements, personally. But
absolutely,
you mentioned this. I want to get into this idea of relentlessness and this idea of. I've said before, that I've told you before, that what it reminds me of is a rather obscure Zen master. His name was Albert Lowe. He wrote a book called The Iron Cow of Zen, and in it he issued a prescription that was based on the Diamond Sutra of arouse the mind without allowing it to rest anywhere. And this is it was a call to rouse people who had gotten to a state that of bliss, of apparent bliss,
right,
of a quiet mind, certainly there are practices, there's meditation and other practices that can lead people into very profound and sublime states.
Absolutely.
And Lowe was kind of poking the bear. And his challenge was to, you mentioned the word vigilance.
Yeah.
His challenge was to remain vigilant. If I was to summarize, I'd say it was to remain vigilant in emptiness. And, right. So if I follow your prescriptions and I follow your advice, but I've got a job, I've got kids, and I've got, a household to take care of, and I've got friends, and I've got responsibilities. How is it that I can surrender when I'm dealing with my boss or the annoying coworker, or when my wife gets mad at me, or
Right. Well, this is a very, very, very central and common question. And so, the real truth is, right, that so what is surrender, for example, really saying, right? It's based on an underlying truth, right, which is very difficult for the mind to believe, which is that the mind, or rather I should say you, or what you think you are, is not the doer of actions. You think generally, the general you thinks that you are in control of your actions, but actually you're not. And an analogy I often use, it's like it's like you're playing a video game or something like that, but the controller isn't really connected to the TV. There's an illusion of control, and it's a very persuasive, compelling illusion of control. And when you challenge this illusion of control, there are going to be voices that then come out and will start screaming fearful things like, "Oh, you better do this or else," and those are the habits that basically compel the mind in its usual paths and keep it away from examining itself. So surrender is about it's about challenging that illusion and aligning yourself with the truth that you're not in control. And not only you're not in control, really, nor are you the experiencer of either the positive or the negative consequences of life. You know, the person that you think you are, I often say, it's like, it might as well be somebody else. You know, you think you're this person, it's actually like, that's somebody else. They're doing their thing, living their life, experiencing positive, negative consequences. You're not that person. And so, of course, it feels like you're that person. That's the whole problem. That's the egoic illusion. And so, I mean, this is why, of course, you need some intellectual framework. You need, you need to deal with emotional issues. And ultimately, you want to build up to the point where you can start to challenge this illusion. Now, that may not be possible for everybody. Almost nobody will be able to do it in a full-blown way at the beginning, right? So what happens is you start chipping away at it to the extent that you can, right? So, and everybody is at a different position, and wherever you are, you do what you can, which may mean, it may mean for some people doing surrender, a few minutes here and there, right? But, for the, and that will build, because even doing it a little bit, though it's not sufficient, to get all the way, it will start to orient the mind towards an inner peace. The mind is usually oriented towards looking for satisfaction in objects and situations. And when it starts to recognize, as Ramana said, that when the cow starts to recognize there's perfectly great oats in its stall, it doesn't need to go out into the field to find grass. It's going to start to learn, I can just relax here. And that's what, that's sort of, the first initial stage, right? So you do a little bit and you start injecting some elements of mental quiet in, either through inquiry or surrender. And slowly that builds and starts to reorient, the patterns of the mind, and that gains the momentum. Now that said, so that momentum builds, at a certain point, it works differently for everybody, right? But at a certain point, one is going to feel ready to try to start doing this, even in situations where it feels fearful, right? Because people are often like, yes, exactly like you said, like, I'm doing a job, I have family, blah blah blah. How can I do surrender and self-inquiry? Well,
so start slow, get in the habit.
Start slow, get in the habit. That's right.
Get a quiet mind.
That's right.
You mentioned mind, and you mentioned emotion, and
Mm-hmm.
intellect. I mean, the subtitle of your first book is Pro-Intellectual God.
Yeah, right. Mm-hmm.
And so, I mean, the intellect, I get the impression when you use the word mind that you're using it in a much more general sense. I mean, so these Zoom calls, right?
Yes.
These talking heads that we see, intellect, mind, some wise people are going to make a distinction between intellect and mind.
Sure.
Whereas
right.
intellect is everything from here on up.
That's right. Right.
Whereas, because these processes that you're talking about, for me, they definitely evoke the whole body and everything that the body is not as well.
Sure.
Would you agree with that?
I mean, sure, absolutely. I mean, so you're right. I mean, the mind-intellect distinction, like, that's in traditional Advaita. There was some distinction like that, but I kind of use them a little bit interchangeably, I admit. And yeah, I mean, it depends on exactly what we're talking about. Funnily enough, right? So it's funny, right? When we think about the intellect, right? Like what exactly that means, right? It does have, and it can be helpful for the seeker. It can also certainly be an obstacle. People can become trapped in intellectual mazes, no doubt whatsoever.
Really? That happens?
Shocking. It's shocking but true. Shocking but true. But it's also interesting, I will say, right? The traditional Advaita understanding, which I always thought quite beautiful, right? Of self-realization in some sense. One description of it is, the pure light of the intellect, the pure light of discrimination, you know, which is, now it's almost a contradiction in terms, because, you know, intellect, you know, being composed of thought is movement and contrast. So what does it mean to say pure intellect? Well, that's why it's sort of it's driving the idea of the intellect to like the very extreme point. But there is something to that, because self-inquiry, for example, you're looking for the I, quote unquote, and in some sense, you know, it lies there as an element of pure discernment, pure discernment. You know, it is in a sense an intellectual function, because you're discerning away all the things that you usually think you are. And that is, one could argue, a kind of intellectual function. And when you've discerned away all the changeable, movable objects, et cetera, well, then, you know, something unspeakable remains, you know, so that, you know, arguably you could say it's a kind of intellectual thing, you know, so, but it's somewhat different, you know, it's a somewhat different use of that word, you know. This is what always happens in non-duality, I find, right? They use words, and it's necessary that this happen, right? You use words one way, and they end up meaning literally the opposite of the initial meaning. You know, I is used one way at the beginning. At the end, it means almost the opposite of what it meant at the beginning, you know? And this is true for a lot of things. But you know, in the traditional, also, it's funny, in the traditional Advaita is much heavier on really breaking your head against what they call these mahavakyas, or great sayings, like, you know, famously like tatvamasi, you know, thou art that, you know, and they really want you to look deeply into the meanings of those words. You know, they feel that it's almost like Zen koans that way, right? I mean, the reality is, I think if one looks deeply into those words, you're going to have to engage in self-inquiry. There's no other way to do it, you know? Mm-hmm. And so it's sort of another way of getting to the same thing. But
people ask that question of self-inquiry without even realizing they're doing it.
Pardon me? Can you repeat that?
Do people ask the question and have the question and kind of work on the question of self-inquiry without even realizing that that's what they're doing?
I'm sure, absolutely, because people, you know, I've talked to people, right, who said, right, like when I mentioned self-inquiry to them, even people who aren't necessarily spiritual seekers at the time, but they say, oh yeah, you know, as a kid, I remember thinking about that sort of question, you know, and it kind of struck me in an odd way. And it did feel like, I may not be this body, you know, who am I then? And I sort of had a sense about that, you know? So I think people do sometimes do self-inquiry. They may not follow up on it, you know, because, you know, it's usually not a one and done thing is the problem. So, you know, people may have like a little aha moment here and there, but that's not going to be, you know, sufficient to find really what a seeker is looking for. But yes, absolutely. I think people do self-inquiry accidentally, involuntarily, without even knowing it. Absolutely, 100%.
So we can live out a meme here. I can say, you're just a person in the world like anybody else. Change my mind. we could do that. Or instead, you know, would you like to tell the NothingConners a little bit about yourself personally? You know, how did you get to this spot here? You know, what happened that brought you here? And, you know, tell us a little bit about your own path and, you know, your own realization.
Sure, absolutely. So, I mean, you know, the narrative I tell, and it's funny because I mean, I have to bracket it like that because.
Oh, right. I should have. I meant to do this. I had it in my notes to do this. I'm sorry. Would you like to qualify your story before you tell it?
I certainly will qualify.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
I certainly will qualify
okay.
because it's just a story. Yeah. It's a story, you know. It's a story, and the reality is, right? Reality is precisely about how the story we tell about ourselves is not what it seems to be. You know, it doesn't actually represent, it's not accurate with respect to ultimate reality, basically. So that said, okay, I can speak in this context because, there are different contexts in which, we're speaking. And and obviously if, I mean, people mock non-dual people this way, right? Like they say,
no, that never happens.
How are you? Oh, I don't even exist, right? This is brown bear nonsense, right? So, I mean, there's clearly different contexts in which we speak. So, okay, so my narrative, I'll give a brief overview. Basically, when I was in my teens, I was experiencing some depression, pretty severe depression in high school. And why was I experiencing depression? I mean, I viewed it at the time as purely existential, like, why are we here? What's the point of it all? Now, the reality was, as I learned later, is it wasn't purely existential, it was also psychological and emotional. And it had to do with my childhood and lots of things that I wasn't admitting to myself about myself. Mm-hmm. But that's where it began. And I will say that there is some real truth to this very ancient saying that, when the student is ready, the teacher will come. And it did happen that way for me because, there was a Hindu monk, Swami Bodhananda Saraswati, who was traveling to the United States for the first time and happened, my mother knew him through extended family. He decided to stay with her for a few weeks. And I was, an ardent atheist at the time, extremely skeptical and argumentative, totally unlike now. And
does your mother now regret introducing you to the Swami? Given all the money she spent on the college and the
oh God, oh yeah, let's not even talk about that. Let's not even talk. She might. This is actually every Indian parent's nightmare. Every Indian parent's nightmare. No. Right. Yeah. Spirituality is for in traditional Indian things like, it's for later in life. Like first you go and you get your career and you make money and you have a family and you have kids and you do all of that.
Right. And
then maybe like when you're like old and useless, you might then spend your final years, looking up God, perhaps. Sure. So yes. So to your point, yes, I think that might she would probably have preferred that I be a high-powered lawyer.
Sorry to digress.
But, no, it's okay.
So you met the Swami. Right?
Yeah, so I met the Swami. I got to talking, and unlike people in the past, where I talked to them, religious figures, and asked them questions, and they would sort of like dismiss me, probably because they didn't know the answers. They weren't able to actually articulate them. He was able and willing to engage, and he's very intellectual, and he's very well versed in the scriptures. And so, we got to talking and I would debate him endlessly, for the few weeks he was there. And, he came for a few years through high school and I would do that, every year. And even when I got into college, I would tend to visit him for a couple of years, just for a couple of weeks at a time, but we would sort of spend this intense concentrated time doing these like very long question and answer sessions. And then, I mean, in between, I no doubt read and thought about this stuff. And he comes from, I would say, a more traditional Advaita path. And, it's more heavy on the intellect, actually. And so it gave me conceptual foundations. But that was just really the beginning because, then I soon found out when I tried to apply this in my life, I was running into motivational problems. Like I couldn't motivate myself to do these certain, I had this whole list of things I wanted to do, spiritually, right? Like eating right and sleeping right and exercising right and almost living like this monk, even though while I was in college, so that I could, get to whatever I thought this was. But I couldn't do it. Sorry?
College, not the most conducive environment.
College, not really the most conducive environment to this. Correct. That's right. That's exactly right. And, but so yes, I mean, so then I was like, okay, what's going on? I don't know. So I've been spending, I encountered all kinds of issues, procrastination, low energy, and inner conflict. And it was only several years later when I confronted the fact that I was gay, actually. And this was something that I had been hiding from myself and didn't want to confront. And when I finally was able to confront it, that was just the beginning of my journey along that path. But it was a big deal, and it revealed to me the power of self-deception, how one can deliberately ignore the obvious, how one can deliberately avoid looking in that corner of the room. It's right there in that corner of the room, and you can just not look at it. You refuse to look at it. So then it was, from there I was like, at that point, probably like 2001, 2002, I'd already encountered Ramana Maharishi. And, I already knew he was important, and I felt his profundity, but I also knew I didn't understand him. And I tried to understand him, but I didn't understand him. I didn't understand what he was getting at, but I knew he was important. And so over the next, I don't know, decade or more, I was like struggling with a lot of like career issues and love issues and blah, 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 all this stuff. I mean, it was growth, but it was a lot of inner conflict and struggle. Eventually, and I was sort of keeping sort of on the spiritual path to some extent, but I also deviated for long periods of time, doing other things, being distracted by the world in various ways, doing many bouts of school that I ended up not using, as you pointed out, and not pleasing to my mother. But I ended up eventually, entering a period of several years of psychoanalysis, which actually was really helpful. And I do credit it with opening, with loosening some of those inner conflicts. Why one of the reasons I recommend it so highly, because I really see it in my own experience, loosening some of those inner conflicts. And so what happened was, I encountered Ramana Maharishi initially, probably 2001, 2002, kind of then sort of forgot about him, was still doing some spiritual stuff of various sorts, although I was kind of flailing around, really not quite knowing what I was doing. I felt like the traditional stuff, the traditional approach, just wasn't really working for me, like I wasn't able to follow it, or I wasn't able to understand. I don't know what the issue was, but just wasn't quite working. Again, like I had a pretty good intellectual understanding of it, but I wasn't really able to instantiate it in my experience, for lack of a better word. But I was still searching. And so, when in about 2014 or 2015, I don't know, someone asked me to sort of lead a little study group about Hinduism and Advaita, because I was still quite steeped in it. I decided, for some reason, fortuitously, let me pick up Ramana again, let's see what he has to say. And I found, after several years of therapy and all this inner work of various kinds, hey, he makes a lot more sense now.
Okay.
and it was much clearer to me, much clearer. And so that sort of led to ultimately about a year and a half of a very, very intense self-inquiry. And I really tried, and also surrender. And I really tried, and at a certain point, I remember, I was getting, like, I described it as like the lights were flashing on and off, like I was getting these aha insights, but they would slip away, and I call them glimpses, and I would get frustrated because I was like, I was there, I would say, and then why is it slipping away? But I kept pursuing it, and I did find that these periods of some kind of insight, which the mind can't fully represent, were occurring more often and were lasting longer and longer. But nevertheless, it wasn't enough, because they would still be prone to being lost. And that would frustrate me more and more. I'm like, what does it take? And eventually what happened was, I remember after one period of surrender like this, I was like, and again, I'd slipped out of it, somehow gotten engrossed in some thought. And I don't know, like at that point I just said, which I'm sure I had done many times before. But I was like, like, who am I? Who am I really, And for whatever reason, at that particular point in time, there was clarity. You know, there was clarity, and there was a clarity such that I knew that things had come to an end. You know, like the period of seeking was over, and yeah, I mean, that's basically how I would describe it. Now, you know, a lot of people think, you know, it's the mind which understands the self, and I have to be very clear that it's not. You know, the mind is an instrument of doubt and uncertainty. Mind never understands the self, but the mind somehow learns to get out of the way, you know, and at a certain point, that's what happened. So, yeah, that's basically, in short form, the narrative.
Okay. Yeah, I mean that this is a very common theme we see in the culture, the idea of getting in touch with our inner authority, right? And learning to trust ourselves.
Yeah.
And I mean, how would you describe that relative to when you were seeking, especially in that year when you mentioned where you were intensely following? So in other words, this advice you give to relentlessly remain on that question, right?
Yes.
This was something that you actually followed yourself.
Yes, that's right.
Were you asking yourself the same question during that time? Did the question vary? Did it, you know, did it even have the form of a verbal thought at that point?
You know, sometimes, right? So, you know, I think I must have, started it. I think what happened is you know, I started asking, let's say, who am I, verbally, and trying to understand that. And at a certain point, what would happen is, you know, well, initially I'd probably fall into some kind of mental silence. And then, as I say, at certain points, I would get these moments of insight, and like as if a window would open up, and I would, quote unquote, get it. But then it was only for a moment, you know, and I found that as I was doing that, I needed to rely less and less, and then very quickly, probably not at all on those words, but that there was just an attentional direction that I could move toward, and very rapidly come to that. And that's what I tell people now, right? That really isn't about asking the words, who am I? Although there's nothing wrong with that, can be helpful. But that it's turning the attention towards this very immediate knowledge of our own existence, you know, which is whatever you want to call it. Is it a feeling? Is it a sense? I don't know what we want to call it. It's none of these things really, but that's what I learned to sort of tune into, and sort of rapidly, you know, and then that became, I think what happened is at a certain point that became very effortful. Then I was reading Ramana, a lot of talks of Ramana Maharishi. I read that book over that year and a half, probably 3, if not 4 times in its entirety, all 700 pages of it. And I felt like that was also very key, because talks with Ramana Maharishi, I think it's his most important book, even though he's written certain books that are, you know, his writing, but these dialogues, there's something about, I don't know, at least for me, it felt like his way of being was somehow permeating that. And, you know, in some sense, it felt like I was in contact with it.
Wow. If there was one dialogue that, you know, if you were to pick out one, you know, which one would it be?
I can't pick one out, unfortunately.
You just can't, huh?
I can't. There's too many, and it's not really about any particular thing he says. You know, there's a certain style he has, and that style is what's communicating the thing, you know? So you read it over and over, and people are coming at him from all different angles, and he's responding, you know, and it's really not the particular content of any response. It is, you start to grasp that there's something beneath those, you know, and that somehow it fuels something, you know. That's what I would say, you know. So I thought that was really super, super helpful. But yes, I mean, eventually went to, you know, from self-inquiry, it sort of moved over to surrender, and you know, and I found that with surrender, I could be in these long periods of bliss and peace that you described. But as I say, you know, that wasn't enough, because those were still prone to being lost, and that made them unacceptable. So, so yes, I would get, you know, ultimately it was frustration, you know, it's frustration that I couldn't maintain them forever. That is what sort of, I think, you know, led me to the end. But what was happening in that process, you know, it's necessary, you know, what was happening in that process were, I do think my, you know, my mental habits were changing, you know, my concentration was increasing dramatically. You know, my motivation to spiritual search was increasing dramatically. My access to inner peace was increasing dramatically. These are all markers of progress. You know, my glimpses and insights were all increasing, right? These are not the end, but they're just markers of progress. And so, you know, you have to go beyond them all, I think, but they are sort of like mileposts along the road. At least they were for me.
You mentioned that the book that you concentrated on was the Book of Dialogues, and that's your second book, right?
Yes.
You published
yes,
a set of dialogues that you've had with seekers over the years.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, a whole bunch of people have asked me a lot of questions about all the kinds of topics, from, you know, philosophical topics to questions about the intricacies of self-inquiry and surrender, to things like, do psychedelics help with the search? And, you know, I mean, just all kinds of questions from all kinds of angles. And yeah, so I mean, I was answering them, and ultimately I felt like, hey, this would be a useful thing to compile for people and represent sort of my views on things.
Okay, and you got a YouTube channel as well.
I do.
What's the name of that second book with the dialogues?
So it's just called Spiritual Dialogues with Akilesh.
Okay. And were the dialogues, are they all face-to-face, or some of them online? You know?
They were almost entirely online, one way or the other.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
They were, you know, through email or sometimes in various forums, you know, yeah, sort of a combination of things, but it was entirely online.
I am that for the modern age.
That's right. Exactly. So,
right.
But yeah, you're right. So thank you for mentioning my YouTube channel. I feel like that's where I often, in some sense, you know, as I'm engaging with my students, I'm very fortunate to have one-on-one students who are really bright, engaged, interesting, sincere people. You know, that really, it really has forced me to elaborate some of my concepts in different ways and find new ways of saying the same thing, you know, differently. And so a lot of that goes into my videos, because I feel like it's a very spontaneous medium, and I'm just sort of able to put it out there. And so, yeah, so, I mean, that's my YouTube channel is, you know, Sifting to the Truth. It's called Sifting to the Truth, which is, you know, also in my website, siftingtothetruth.com. But I feel like a lot of my sort of most immediate thinking is done through those videos, you know. New metaphors. I feel like metaphors are very, very useful. You know, metaphors are both misleading, but also extremely useful.
Sure. So, you know, you're mentioning this gradual dichotomy. You know, this gradual process, right? But I mean, how is it that you can use time and you can use change to arrive at a realization of what's always the case, always here and now, and never changes and isn't relative? I mean, how does that even relate? I mean, what, you know, I don't understand why we're bothering with this thing yet. I don't get the point.
I mean, it's a great question. You know, it's because what we're dealing with is something which is at the very boundary between those two things. You know, that's what it is, right? So it's not quite in time. You know, this thing called a realization, right? Quote unquote. You know, not quite in time, not quite out of time. It's why the gateless gate is on one side it has time on it, on the other side it doesn't. You know, so again, we can only describe things using metaphors, right? you're absolutely correct in some sense that, yes, look, from the ultimate standpoint, does it matter if anyone seeks? No, it doesn't, because the ultimate is the ultimate regardless.
Great.
Let's be clear about that, okay? But the seeker, the seeker wants something. The seeker wants something. The seeker wants liberation from unhappiness and wants existential truth, and those things are, those cravings can be satisfied. I'll just put it that way.
Satisfied.
I mean, but
you mean self-realization at the end of self-inquiry is self-satisfaction?
It's the end of certain particular types of unsatisfaction. I'll put it that way.
Okay.
And that's one way of looking at it, right? So it's again, we're dealing with something which is, so here's an example, right? So this is an example which I sometimes use, right? Imagine that you were reading a book that was written in the first person. Okay, so it uses the word I. Okay, so if in this book you read the words, I went to the grocery store. Now, does anyone actually go to the grocery store? No. It's just the words, I went to the grocery store. But the reader reading these words projects an imaginary person going to the grocery store. So that imaginary person is not in the words themselves, nor is that imaginary person in the reader. It is like an interaction between the reader and the words. This fiction is created. Now, if later in the book you read the words, God, I'm really suffering so much, right? Is anyone actually suffering? Right? Again, the answer is no, right? Those are just words, but nevertheless, the reader reads the words and projects an imaginary person who's suffering, right? And then later, if you read you read the words like, I'm looking for the existential truth, again, it's the same thing applies. And finally, if you read the words, I've realized I'm just a set of words in a book, right? I mean, if you read those words in a book, has anyone actually had that realization? Really? I mean, it kind of depends on your definition, you could argue, right? I mean, really, 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 probably no, right? Because there's nobody in the book. But at the same time, there is this imaginary creation which went through the suffering and then went through the seeking and then went through the quote unquote finding, right? That's what's happened, And so, and that's an analogy for the search. Now, why does this person seek? Well, there's different answers to that question. Ultimately, you could say they had no choice about it, which is pretty close to the truth. But the real answer is, when one looks deeply into the eye, that very question, that way of looking at things is itself seen to be a kind of illusion, right? So the frame within which those kinds of questions are asked, like, for example, the question you just asked, which is, well, why seek at all? Well, so these contradictions in explanation about, yes, keep seeking, but you're already what's sought, and all these sort of seemingly conceptual contradictions, they're a result of thinking in a particular frame. The end result of the search is an exit of that frame. I don't want to even say a frame change, because that would suggest a different frame. And I'm trying to get out of the very concept of frames is the problem. So these are only
most people, I think, would grasp. The problem is the frame itself. It's like, the metaphor of telling a fish about water.
Right, exactly. It is. That's right.
Oneness is this case that you can't you talk about.
That's right.
And once we talk about it, we kill it. And
exactly.
So it's like,
Exactly.
I mean,
but then what choice do we have but to talk about it, or whatever? Maybe we do have a choice. I don't know. We can be silent, but
If no one's going to, all I can say is if no one's going to the grocery store, then that solves my weight loss problem.
Whose weight loss problem?
Right. Yeah. And and speaking of time, I think we're pretty close to near the end of ours for the Nothing Conners. Would you have something that you'd like to close with to tell our friends?
Good question. So, I guess I just want to explain sort of, I think what might distinguish me from other spiritual teachers that people might be considering. You know, I am coming from you know, a knowledge of Advaita Vedanta, but it is, you know, it is filtered through a lot of the work of Ramana Maharishi. It has these inflections, as we've discussed, of philosophy and psychoanalysis, right? So these are certain elements that I bring to my work that other spiritual teachers may or may not, you know, and especially the intricacies of surrender and self-inquiry is what I have found that that I'm able to help people with, you know, and if people are looking for, you know, real specifics on how to go about that, you know, I feel like that might be something where I could be of help. So I want to encourage people to, you know, if they're seeking, if they're sincere seekers, I mean, I love talking to them, and feel free to email me any questions, you know, about my work or just questions about the spiritual search. And, you know, and I do work with people one-on-one, you know, often on Zoom. So that's another option too. So that's mainly what I wanted to say. I mean, there, you know, it's a practice-based path, but it's not one which is, it's not like, I think, certain versions of Buddhism where there are all kinds of levels and paths, you know, stages and things like that. You know, I like to keep it very simple. And that's the beauty of Ramana Maharishi. Surrender and self-inquiry are very, very simple. But at the same time, while the methods are simple, the obstacles that can arise can present some complications. And I think that's where a teacher can be useful. So, yeah, I think that's more or less how I'd like to close.
AK, thanks very much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much, Bill. This was wonderful. Thank you so much.
All righty.